The Years of National Government. Chapter 5. Outside Influences. The Phony War. The Committee for Imperial Defence agreed that a subcommittee should be instigated to look into the organisation for a war, of civil and home defence, censorship and war emergency legislation. This group was called the Air Raid Precautions Subcommittee, eventually to be run by General Ismay. In 1933, local authorities were chosen as the agencies to be responsible for local organisation. The ARP was organised as a department of the Home Office under the control of Wing Commander E. J. Hodsall in 1935. The same year, Germany re-established her Air Force. It was this action which drove the ARP to start issuing instructions to local authorities, merchant shipping lines and fire services. In September 1935, local authorities were invited to make plans for building shelters, and these were to be made out of brick and roofed over with reinforced concrete. We had one built at the bottom of our road, only used for the first few air raid warnings, but gradually neglected and left damp, dark, and very uninviting. Gradually, the possibility of war increased to the extent that in 1937 the ARP issued an appeal for volunteers, and a year later the ARP Act came into force, compelling all local authorities to set up schemes to enrol wardens, first aid and ambulance services, gas precautions. The auxiliary fire services included rescue, repair and demolition. There would be first aid posts, gas decontamination centres and casualty clearing stations. That year, in 1938, the service was put on standby and trenches dug in all London parks and sandbags filled to protect doorways. Sticky paper was placed on windows to stop them shattering. The duties of the police were increased. Unable to carry out all the tasks, a band of police reserves took over some of their jobs. Later, in 1938, the Women's Voluntary Service was formed to help the ARP. They did most of the tasks asked of the men, including being responsible for children, providing food and medical support. Sir John Anderson started to distribute 1.5 million shelters made out of steel curved plates as a roof, sealed at either end by further steel plates. It measured 6.5 by 4.5 feet and is meant to accommodate 6 people. The shelters were supposed to be half buried, and in the event they became filled with water or at best extremely damp. These shelters were free to the poor or cost £7 to the well-paid. Morrison shelters were issued 3 years later and represented a heavy steel table with wired sides to sleep 2 adults. Our ARP man cycled round on his bike in his normal civilian clothes, with a black and white armband. He was a part-time volunteer. When the blackout restrictions came into being, the auxiliary fire service was too. It was the start to all the other emergency arrangements put into place. The early air raid warning sirens droned its message, warning of an approaching enemy aircraft. The wardens were trained in all aspects of rescue work, first aid, bomb protection, and supervised the use of road shelters. The Civil Defence Services didn't get their uniforms until 1941. After Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister, in May 1937, the topic of the country's newspapers was politics, international rather than home. The main point of discussion was about stopping Italy and Germany from expanding their economies by armament production and seeking to enlarge their territories by force. The new Prime Minister elected to do this by giving in to their demands in a spirit of cooperation and reasonableness, to win them over by friendliness. Chamberlain acted desperately to stop the progression towards this aggressive behaviour. This period of appeasement lasted over a year. Towards the end, the inevitability of war became apparent, and national defence took the place of the previous concessions. It was the then Foreign Secretary, Edward Halifax, who realised the extent of German ambitions when Hitler occupied the final part of Czechoslovakia in March 1939. He did an about-face, pushing Chamberlain to offer a guarantee to the Polish nation that Britain would support them if threatened by an outside force. The Prime Minister lost all credibility when Norway fell to a German invasion, supported Halifax to succeed him as leader. Halifax realised that he wasn't up to the job and that he wouldn't have the full support of the Conservative Party. Churchill was asked by the King to form a coalition with Labour and Liberal participation. Imperial Defence. War was declared on the 3rd of September 1939. The following day, the Committee for Imperial Defence started England's war machine. The defence team included Major Leslie Hollis, Wing Commander William Elliot, Major Ian Jacob, and Lieutenant Lord Coleridge. This was late combined into a single War Cabinet Secretariat under Sir Edward Bridges, and the military side under General Ismay. It was Ismay who informed Churchill of suggestions and decisions made. Britain entered the war supplying only 40% of the country's needs. The Ministry of Food was formed on the 8th of September under William Morrison as its head. In July 1940, the local defence volunteers had their name changed to the Home Guard. This force stayed in existence until December 1944. During their occupational service, they manned guard posts, observation posts and coastline defences, whilst acting to combat parachutists and spies. Some were even trained to act as guerrilla units behind enemy lines. Sirens. Stanley, my brother, started school for the first time that week war was declared, and I followed on a year later. We expected German planes to fly over immediately. None arrived. The air raid sirens were sounded for the first time to alert people to their sound. The local air raid protection officer cycled round on his bike, blowing his whistle, shouting out that when we heard the sirens we should take cover. Evacuations. In London the evacuation started. Queues formed outside mainline stations for children to be led off to their appointed trains. Sandbags were being hurriedly filled and placed at door entrances, and directions posted telling people where their nearest air raid shelters were sited. Volunteers were asked for to fill vacancies for jobs on the home front as air raid wardens, ambulance drivers and fire service. Women, too, were not excluded, manning firefighting posts, enrolled as bus conductors and ambulance drivers. My parents didn't consider it necessary for us boys to be evacuated. Whether or not they would have done, if they had joined in a scream, or if we had lived in the heart of London, I don't know. It was never mentioned, even after the largest air raids during the Blitz. Allotments. Dig for Victory. The government's slogan, Dig for Victory, emblazoned posters and hoardings. The charismatic Minister of Food, Lord Woolton, instigated this call to the nation, which became a great success. He promoted various schemes for improving plant growth, printing books and leaflets detailing the importance of compost heaps and plant care. This was done using cartoon pictures of two characters, Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete. Carrots were considered necessary to help see in the dark, promoted by a fighter pilot describing how he managed to shoot down a German plane in the dark. On the radio there was much talk about happenings on the home front, keeping the population alive to the need of self-help. Walton's slogans and posters were first used in September 1939, extolling everyone to consider every plot of ground to grow fruit and vegetables, to be self-sufficient. The majority of our neighbours did so, in various degrees. My father dug out some plots in the lawn, built a large chicken run stocked with laying boxes and kept a rabbit. Some neighbours produced their own vegetables, others kept chickens and ducks. Some chose to keep both. There was a scheme to breed more pigs. A special pig food collection scheme was put into place for shopkeepers and the general public to contribute to. Local parks and recreation grounds were ploughed up for wheat production, as was spare railway land and roadside verges. All these schemes were put into place, certainly at the start of the war, with government leaflets and booklets giving instructions on all aspects of planting. One was entitled Allotments and Garden Guide, published in 1943. The production of garden kitchens and allotments was so successful that natural fertilizers and manure ran out. A national Grow More fertilizer was made out of balanced chemicals, available by George Munro and Sons. Gradually, these petered out as the war progressed, as it became more obvious that the war was being won. 80% of all allotments were to be found in urban areas. The Ministry of Agriculture promoted a scheme for the unemployed in conjunction with the Society of Friends, the National Allotments Committees, and a number of benevolent societies. Dig for Victory was a huge success, began without any idea that it would have such a long-lasting effect upon the community. Imports of food dropped by 50% and the acreage of land ploughed up increased by 80%. And once the habit was formed and the people caught on to its worthwhileness, it became something to be proud of. It became a talking point with one's neighbours. Make do and mend. The effort to become less reliant on imports ran with the national effort to make do and mend. This was to stop people wastefully buying new things, many of them being imports. Schools and local social groups collected scrap metal and ran jumble sales to collect money to help buy an aeroplane. Other groups knitted socks or gloves for the military. Merchant ships were commissioned to transport war materials, troops, and the few items that the country was incapable of producing for itself. Before the war, Britain imported 55 million tons of food, mostly from America and Canada. This was cut in half. As children, we carefully collected bottles to take back to the shop for the payment of a halfpenny. Newspapers and magazines carefully hoarded, and old iron, aluminium pots and pans ended up on the scrap heap. The rag and bowman circled the streets with his horse and cart, as did the scrap metal collector. Iron railings were offered up, and the pig cart arrived to take away kitchen scraps for the council pigs. Household baths could only be filled but to 4 inches, rags sewn together to make rugs, wool wound on sticks then cut to size, knotted on hessian to make wool rugs, bricks placed at the back of the fire to save room for the scarce coal, and mothers always knitting for the family or for the army. Jigsaws entertained the family on long winter nights whilst listening to Itmar and Tommy Handley or Have a Go with Wilfred Pickles. Rationing. It didn't take the government long before food had to be rationed. Clothing, coal and petrol soon added to the list. Game birds, rabbits, hares, horse meat and chickens weren't rationed at all. Ration books were issued on September 1939 in readiness for the start date, January the following year. The rationing point system was put into place to regularise distribution. pregnant women, young children and those on a diet had their special needs catered for. There weren't any objections to a rationing, as everyone thought it equitable. As for any black market, it was talked about, but we were never involved, and I'm sure my mum would not have known where to have got it. Householders had to declare where they were going to shop when they filled in their ration book. Healthy eating wasn't mentioned at home. It wasn't thought about or planned for. We ate exactly what we had always eaten, the diet we were used to. Didn't require great changes to be made or thinking about. Any deficiencies, like the lack of sugar, was made up by saccharine. Lack of fresh milk by adopting powdered. The same as eggs and potatoes. The dried eggs were tried but only used in cooking. The dried potatoes were simply awful and never eaten. Mum was a wonder at making meals look appetising even if they were lacking in quality or quantity. Rabbit and fish were eaten more times than before the war. Mince was liberally bulked out with bread, onion and carrot. Spam was fried or made into toad in the hole. Milk puddings, apple pies, blackberries from the country hedge, rhubarb, bread and butter puddings, suet puddings and dried fruit with junket. Only very occasionally Mum borrowed sugar from next door. The London County Council organised a meals service which started in September 1940, and from this evolved the British restaurants, designed for emergency eating, especially for those bombed out. By mid-1941 there were 200 working. One of them was built at the bottom of our road. It was that September 1940 that Germany began 58 consecutive nights of bombing. This was the Blitz. The first time we saw, felt and appreciated the seriousness of the situation. I was 5 and going to school. The last days of 1939. We were all quite disappointed when we heard our Prime Minister declaring war. We believed the guns would start firing immediately and bombs would start dropping. Wasn't to be. Despite the country's guarantee to Poland, the government had no plans to conduct a war. This was known as the Phony War and lasted for about 9 months. And it's just as well, for we were ill prepared, and 9 months would give us some chance to catch up and show our mettle. My father was the regiment's longest serving non-commissioned soldier. As regimental sergeant major, his task was to instill discipline and act as a sort of policeman, making sure standards were kept and routines upheld. He was decommissioned as a major, becoming the second in command, dealed off to start planning for the supposed German invasion. One of his tasks was to develop a corps of individuals to lay low after an invasion, to act as a behind-an-invasion guerrilla force. His task was to plan and staff a number of secret hideaway locations in and around Epping Forest, only to surface after the Germans had passed by to counterattack them from the rear. I do hope that this account has made the picture clear. These are not jaundiced or romanticised views, but drawn from reliable sources and from my own memory of times lived and observed. If you read in the first 15, you will complete the picture with a bit more colour.